Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World, the podcast that celebrates the remarkable women of the Viking Age. From fierce warriors and powerful queens to wise seers and cunning goddesses, these women left an indelible mark on history. Join authors Johanna and K.S. each month as we explore the stories, achievements, and impact of Norse women. Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World. This is episode 16, part 2 of our discussion about Norse goddesses. Last month, we talked about Freya, Frigg, Gullveig, Skadi, and others. So if you haven't listened to it, check it out. It's episode 15, which came out in June. I'm K.S. Barton, author of the Norse Family Trilogy, the story of a young woman and a young Viking warrior caught in the middle of a deadly blood feud. And with me is Johanna Wittenberg. Hi, Johanna.
Hi, how are you?
Great.
Good. Well, I'm Johanna Wittenberg. I'm the author of the Norse Women series, which is the story of Queen Åsa, who was a real Norse queen who lived and ruled alone in the early Viking Age.
All right, last month we left off with the Jotun Skadi, who married Njord and entered into the world of the Aesir gods. And in this episode, we're going to talk about a few more Aesir goddesses and a few Jotun. First, we'll start with Sif. And Sif's claim to fame is that she's married to the god Thor. That's basically her claim to fame. Her name is actually the singular of the Old Norse word Sifjar, which means family relations. So her entire identity is basically her relationship to her family, which doesn't seem quite unusual for that time period. In this case, it's her husband Thor and her son Ullr. So she's the mother of the god Ullr by a man other than Thor, although who this guy is not known. Ullr is best known as a skilled skier and an archer whom no one can rival. He's handsome and skilled, so not a bad combination. And Viking warriors often called on Ullr when they went into single combat. I don't know why we don't know about him more, because that seems like that would be a god that we should know more about.
So much has really been just lost about many of the gods. And I was just thinking about something. When you say family relations about Sif, the meaning of her name, is it possible it also means ancestress?
Oh.
It just popped in my head.
Yeah, it could.
I don't have any research to back it up, but it just was like, Anyway, there was more to Sif as well. It's just all we know of her is her parenting of these people.
Yes, and I was mentioning the single combat, and in Norse culture, because blood feuds were a common problem and they could go on for generations, especially in Iceland. One way to ease that back and forth nature of killing that occurred during a blood feud was to have the men meet in single combat, either an einvigi or a holmgang. And the einvigi was an unregulated fight that typically ended in death, while a holmgang was regulated and formal. It was a formal duel. That one, there was a special place marked out. Ropes were put up around the dueling field, and they even sometimes had a second to give them fresh shields or whatever. And unlike the einvigi, the holmgang didn't end in death.
Well, and that means going to the island. Holmgang means going to the island.
Yeah.
And so, there's some ideas that maybe they originally took place on skerries, because there were lots of little islets and skerries that were rocky all over Scandinavia.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
But also, normally it was roped off, and if you stepped out of bounds, you could lose. There was if you got one foot out, it was called going on the heel. And I can't remember the penalty for that, but it was so it's lots of very structured rules to it.
Yeah. That's really common in duels and battles like that. Stepping out of bounds, you're done.
Yep.
Yeah.
It was like you were running away.
Yeah.
If you weren't intentionally running away, it still counted.
So I had in one of my books, one of my main male characters, there was this guy, they were enemies, and they finally decided to end it with an ein Vigi. So this one was going to the death. And before he left, his wife kind of blessed him with strength of Uller.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
I have one where they're actually having a homegoing
mm.
on Scary.
Oh,
And
neat.
yes, and but the bad guy actually kills his opponent, and then he becomes outlawed, and they chase him, and so it demonstrates the whole outlaw concept as well.
Yeah, I like that. Back to Sif. Her most famous attribute is her golden hair, which was long and gorgeous. And of course, who had to mess with it?
Loki.
Our friend Loki. So, as a prank, Loki cut off Sif's golden locks. And it just shows you how like inconsequential these poor goddesses are. We don't know how she reacted to this awful prank. All we get is how mad Thor was when he discovered that his wife's hair had been shorn by Loki.
Well, now this is the translator. It's
I
not
know, I
necessarily
know.
the original version of the story.
Yeah. I mean, I'm assuming she would have been just devastated by losing her
You'd
hair.
think.
I mean, Thor was furious. I mean, I'd like to think that Thor actually cared for his wife and, her distress was what made him angry. And maybe he was concerned that his wife would be shamed for having short hair because in Norse culture, a woman's hair was something she took pride in, and her husband might take pride in it as well. And
Mhm.
slaves were often forced to wear their hair short. So Sif's shorn head could have been really humiliating for her.
Well, exactly. That would have been the real insult right there.
Mm-hmm. Thor just grabbed Loki and threatened him as Thor does. Loki swore he'd fix things and find a way to replace Sif's golden tresses.
Good luck, Chuck.
So when the Norse gods need something made, where do they go? To the dwarves.
Oh,
And in this case, it was to the sons of Ivaldi, who were famous and especially talented craftsmen. And this story in itself, there's just all kinds of stuff going on. But in the end, Loki was able to convince the sons of Ivaldi to create new locks for Sif made out of pure gold. But that was not the end of it. He also got them to create other magical items for the gods. So they made Mjolnir, Thor's hammer. And there's a story behind why
yes, it
the
sure has
handle
a
is
short
short.
handle. Yep.
There's Odin's spear Gungnir, Odin's magical ring Dropnir, Frey's ship Skidbladnir, and Frey's golden boar Gullinbursti. So
Boy,
they
they
made,
all profited by this.
yes, they did. And once he retrieved the golden hair from the sons of Ivaldi, Loki brought it to Thor and Sif, and she wore her new hair made from pure gold with pride. And Loki got away with his life again.
Again.
And Loki nearly had his head bashed in by a Thor another time, again at that feast at Lokasenna, when Loki insulted Sif and said that she was unfaithful. So Thor threatened to bash Loki's head in.
Yeah.
So Sif's golden hair has often been considered to be a symbol for grain, and Sif herself an earth goddess, which I think makes perfect sense. With golden tresses that could symbolize sheaths of wheat, she seems very much like an earth goddess. And who better for an earth goddess to marry than the sky god, Thor, with thunder and lightning and all that? And earth and sky have always, in every mythology I've ever read, there's always usually some kind of a divine marriage between earth and sky, or sun and something like that. And in the Scandinavian forest, the plant hair moss is sometimes called Hadr Sifjar, which means Sif's hair.
Oh,
And this particular plant is tall and yellow gold, just like her hair.
oh, how beautiful.
Yeah. So at least she's been memorialized in a beautiful plant.
Yeah. And we have, we at least we have a tale about her. There's
Yeah, that's true.
a
That's
lot
true.
of goddesses are mentioned with not even a story. So
That's true.
one of those goddesses is Thrud, she was the daughter of Thor and Sif. And like Uller, we don't know hardly anything about her. The Prose Edda book Skaldskaparnal Sorry, I can't pronounce that. It states that Thor can be referred to by the Kenning, father of Thrudr, and that her mother is Sif. In Grimnismal, Thrudr is also named as one of the Valkyries, so one that serves ale to the Einherjar in Valhalla. So most likely it's the same person, for goddesses and Valkyries were frequently interchangeable.
Hmm.
It makes you realize that, and it's kind of reminds you of the elves too. The distinction wasn't that cut and dried. We've got the light elves who were Frey was considered the lord of the elves, and we mention in when we talk about the Valkyries, we talk about Skuld, who is a Nornir,
Hmm.
and we talk about Thrud, who is a goddess. Obviously, if both of her parents were gods, then she's a goddess.
Hmm. Yeah.
So, in the book Gylfaginning, which is in the Prose Edda, in chapter 35, they provide a brief description of 16 goddesses. And in many cases, that's the only record we have of their names. So we'll
Hmm.
be talking about some of them in this episode.
Is Thrud the daughter that the dwarf, is it Alfie, wanted to marry?
I
Because
don't know that
I
story.
remember, oh my gosh, I wish I'd thought of this earlier. Because there was an elf who wanted to marry Thor's daughter. And so he and Thor didn't want him to because he didn't like him, but they ended up having a long conversation. And this is one of the few stories in which Thor actually outwits someone else because this particular elf was really wise and knew a lot. And Thor kept asking him a lot of questions about.
I'm kind of vaguely starting to remember that. I
So
don't.
and it's really beautiful actually. And he'll ask the elf about certain things. Like, what about the dwarf about things like, what about the elves? And then it'll just be this beautiful description of what the elves were or what the sky is. And Thor keeps the dwarf talking until sunrise and the dwarf
He turns to
turns to
stone.
stone.
Oh,
Is that through? Oh my
I
gosh.
do remember this. No, I don't know. I don't know.
Ah,
We're gonna have to check that out and find out. We'll look that up. I'm
yeah.
not finding it in any, on the internet, but that doesn't mean that it's not there.
I know I've read it because I think I even wrote about it. Let's
I remember the story of, of the keeping him talking until, but I didn't think he was an elf. He was a troll.
I read he was a dwarf.
Well, it could have been a dwarf, but
Yeah.
a troll and a dwarf, I think, were very similar. But
Yeah.
anyway, we'll have to look that up. Oh,
Oh,
here we go. Wait.
here I just found I
We
blogged
just
about
found
it.
it.
I blogged about it. Alphys the all wise.
Yes.
Yeah, you're right. He was a troll. Well,
Well, troll was
well,
kind
and
of
yeah.
troll was kind of a name that you could use for a lot of different kinds of creatures. It wasn't a specific. Trolls were not a specific
Hmm.
creature. I mean, they
Yeah,
were.
what's the Icelandic scholar's name? Jakobsen? He considers trolls kind of like the boogeyman. Like they use troll like for anything that was kind of scary or they didn't like or whatever. And
Even in Icelandic law, it's against it. They made it against the law to sit out at night and wake up the trolls. They, so the trolls are any kind of magical forces, I think,
yeah, kind
spirits
of
or
like that
whatever.
dark.
But anyway,
Yes.
no, I see that you're right. It's absolutely. He did want to marry Thrud.
Thr-
Yep. Uh,
Yeah.
and Thor, believe it or not, managed to keep him up all night, which is amazing for Thor to be that quick of his wits, because
Yeah.
he's not usually
Uh-huh.
considered that smart. But in this case, he is. Well, that's cool. Okay,
Yeah,
so
and he had
tell
some
more
really
about him.
yeah, he really had some pretty kennings too. Like he said that Alvis, the dwarf, called the elves, said the elves called the night sleep's joy, which I love that. Or that
Yeah.
the gods called the clouds rain hope. So,
Oh,
yeah.
that's great.
Yeah, there's lots of really pretty stuff. And yeah, but he forgot that the sun was coming up and he turned to stone.
Hmm.
So yeah,
It's
and how can you
funny
consider yourself?
how hard it is to find these references.
Yeah.
Very difficult.
And I didn't even think about that when we were putting through it
No.
on our list. I even wrote a blog about that, and I didn't remember that that was the
It's too
same
long ago.
person till just now.
Now we know.
Now we know. Yes, the one time that Thor outwitted someone. So that's Thor and his offspring. And we mentioned Balder in the last episode when we were talking about Hel.
Mhm.
And so Balder had a wife named Nanna. And Balder, we didn't talk about that. He was the most beautiful of the gods. He was beautiful and full of life. It was even said that he like shone, like he gave off light. He was so
Mhm.
beautiful. But that also makes me think of the light elves because they were said to shine. So
Mhm.
I don't know. Maybe he's got some elf in him.
Mhm.
He was also considered wise and gracious and well spoken. He was very well loved. That's why Frigg went to everything in the world to see if it would weep for him, and everything did except Loki in disguise. Or we think it was Loki in disguise. It was
Yeah,
a
it doesn't
Jotun.
say it's Loki, but we have reason to believe that it was.
Yeah. And then Nana was also the mother of Forseti, who was the god who settled lawsuits, which I
Like,
absolutely love the fact that the Norse people had a god who settled lawsuits. I wonder if that came from Icelandic times. Because,
uh,
but I guess the Norwegians and Swedes did too. So in the day,
yeah,
yeah,
they all had their law codes,
yeah,
and yeah, and they all had their things, their assemblies where they settled these things, and that goes way back.
yeah, that's true. I can't remember anything from like Greek or Roman or Egyptian or mythology where they had a god who settled
No.
lawsuits. And in the Prose Edda, when Balder died, Nana's heart exploded with
Oh,
grief and she died.
yeah.
And the other gods put her on the funeral pyre beside Balder. And then, and Johanna mentioned this in the last episode, after Balder's death, the god Hermod, who was a messenger and closely resembles the Greek messenger god Hermes,
Very.
he rode 9 nights in search of Balder in Hell. And when he found them, that's when Hel made her bargain that everything had to weep for Balder. And as a token that Hermod had actually spoken to Balder and Nanna, Balder gave him Odin's ring, Draupnir, which Odin had placed on his funeral pyre, and Nanna gave him a linen robe to give to Frigg and a gold finger ring to give to Fula, who Johanna will talk about in a little bit, which was also a really common practice in the real world to like give a token, a ring or
Mhm.
something to show that you really did speak to this person or that they really were there. But unfortunately for Balder, things didn't work out. And he and Nana, I assume they remained in hell.
Yes.
What does,
And the last thing that the old woman, the old Jotun woman, who we think is Loki, said is let hell keep what she has.
that's right. Do they do anything at Ragnarok? I can't remember if
No,
Nana
they're
and
not. I don't think
Balder do any.
they're not mentioned, and
Yeah.
you'd think that they would be going against the Aesir because of the fact that now, wait a minute, well, let's not go into that right now. That takes too much research. We'll bring that up for a later
Okay.
because it says all the minions, everyone who lives in hell goes against the Aesir.
Oh, right.
Loki leads all the dwelling, but I also thought Balder was mentioned later.
Mm,
But let's not go into that because I don't have time. We don't have time on air to research all these things.
right. We already had one on the spot research
Yes.
blitz.
Yes. So Ran is another goddess, and she is the goddess of the sea. And her name means robbery or plundering. And she has a net in which she captured sailors who drowned. To go to Ran is to drown. In the Lay of Regan, Loki borrows Ran's net to collect Anvari's gold. Ran is married to a Jotun. one of the few female goddesses
Mm.
who's married to a Jotun. His name is Aegir, and their hall is on the seabed where the hearth fire is made of gold.
Oh.
And so a kenning for gold is Aegir's fire or fire of the sea. So they have 9 daughters and they personify the waves. And their names, let me see if I can pronounce them because they're not all easy. Himingleva, Dufa, Blodughada, Hefring, Un, Bron, which means waver, Bilg means waves, Bilgja, which means billow, and Drofen, which means comber, and Kolga, which I don't know what it means.
Hmm.
So, and there are kennings of Ron, and she's called Gymir's spray cold spa wife. So she's able to predict the future because that's what spa is.
Hmm.
So one must go to Ron means to die at sea, and in her hall she keeps, and she's a hostess to the valiant men who died at sea. And in Egil's saga, Egil loses 2 of his sons, one of whom died at sea, and Egil says that Ron has shaken him roughly.
Mm-hmm.
So she is referred to quite a bit in, we don't know a whole lot about her, but we do know that she's referred to a lot as the person who takes the sailors who drown.
I love that that kenning, Aegir's fire. That's
Yeah,
neat. Yeah. I love kennings.
I
They
know.
are so interesting and so sometimes they're so beautiful. And that's another reason why I'm like, Vikings weren't just a bunch of brutes. Their language that they used for some of these things was just extraordinarily beautiful and evocative and just
Well, and they
interesting.
most of these poems they had to compose purely from memory. They didn't write them down.
Right.
So, yeah, intellect was prized
And the
and
ability to,
memory.
yeah, and the ability to speak well and
And
yeah.
to compose some of these poems with their very specific requirements.
hmm Wouldn't it be neat to just like travel back in time, just to be in one of those halls when the Skald was giving one of these poems, saying one of these poems, what it must have been like, what they sounded
I'd love
like.
to be able to see it, not to be there because I don't think I'd last 5 minutes, but I like to just like be able to see it. Yes.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
as it's actually happening. Yeah, I love their use of language. All
so
right.
one of the many goddesses, so in the Prose Edda chapter 35, Gylfaginning, Snorri gives us a whole list of these goddesses.
hmm
And in addition to Frigg and Freya, who are the most noble, there are many others. And so you can tell us about Saga.
Saga. So she lives in Sokvabek, where she and Odin drink happily every day from golden cups. There's a lot of gold
Mm-hmm.
in these stories about the gods. And the word saga is could be related to sea, so she could have been a seeress. It's
Oh,
possible the saga may be another name for Frigg. And Frigg's Hall, Fensalir means Fen's Hall, and Saga's Hall means sunken bank. And those are fairly similar. If she's a seeress, she could have something related with Frigg and her gift of foresight. Saga drinks with Odin every day, and that's something a wife would do. So I don't know, it's possible, or it's
it's
possible she's
possible,
just different. And I don't know why would this other woman be drinking with Odin every day, happily every day?
right?
So yeah, so that's a possibility.
So another one is named Air, and she is described as the best doctor in the Prose Edda. Her name means protection, help, and mercy, and she's a goddess or Valkyrie associated with medical skill. So here again, we have another goddess who is also named as a Valkyrie. She's named as a goddess who oversees childbirth, and as a Valkyrie, she accompanied her battle sisters. And while the Valkyries picked through the slain, Air would choose those who would survive and recover. And
Hmm.
as a chooser of life and death, she's sometimes associated with the Nornir,
Oh,
but she's not one of the Norn. Norn, the word Norn was also used in many different ways. It wasn't only the three Nornir.
Hmm.
It was a type of person, which is very interesting because to me, the Nornir that we think of, the three sisters, they were Jotun
Hmm.
maidens. And so the Nornir is more like a profession or an ability or a skill. And there were human women that were referred to as Nornir as well. And they would come and bless a newborn child, for example. And that's where the whole Sleeping Beauty story comes from.
Hmm.
Anyway, and the evil fairy. But
But yeah, and we want to classify all these. We want to know that this person was this, she was Aesir, or she was a Jotun, or he was this, or they were that. And yet we just see this all the time. She's
it's
mentioned as a
much more
goddess. She's
fluid.
mentioned as a Valkyrie. She could be a Norn. She could be Disir, or just like there's just it was just very fluid. Are the elves also gods? Are they different? Like you said, Freyr is the Lord of the Elves. So are they maybe Vanir? Are they, who is it, like we want to just put them in these nice, neat little boxes. They just don't go there.
Exactly. Exactly. Yep, that's right. So another goddess was named Gefjon. And I think I'm pronouncing that right. And so according to the Prose Edda, Gefjon was the fourth goddess of the Aesir, following Frigg, Saga, and Aer. And Gefjon was a virgin, and women who died unmarried went to her. The symbol for her is a plow, and there's a story in Gylfaginning in the Prose Edda that talks about a King Gylfi, which is who this whole thing is about. He was a king in what is now called Sweden, and it's said that he was said to have given a certain vagrant woman as a reward for his entertainment as much as her 4 oxen could plow up in a day and a night. This woman was of the race of the Aesir, and her name was Gefjon. She took 4 oxen from Jotunheim in the north, and these oxen were her sons by a Jotun who's not named. So here's a goddess who's married to a Jotun, and she has 4 sons by him. And she hitches them up to a plow. And it's said that her plow cut so hard and deep that it uprooted the land, and the oxen drew the land out into the sea to the west and halted in a certain sound or body of water. And Gefjon there placed all the land that she had plowed up and bestowed upon it the name of Zealand. So that's in Denmark, right?
Hmm.
So she took the land from Sweden and brought it to Denmark. And where the land had been taken from, a lake now stands. And according to Snorri, this is the Lake Malar, located in Sweden. And the inlets in this lake parallel the headlands of Zealand. So that's the story.
That's cool.
Yeah, isn't it cool? So in the Poetic Edda, Gefjon only appears in the 3 stanzas of the poem from the Lokasenna, which you've quoted several times with all he roasts all the goddesses.
Yeah. And the gods too. He roasts everybody.
He does. And in this exchange between Loki and Idun, which you've talked about earlier, Gefjon questions why Loki wants to bring this negativity into the hall with the assembled gods. And he
Good for her.
replies, "Silence, Gefjon. I remember that boy who seduced you into his bed. That handsome boy gave you a necklace, and you opened your thighs for him." Anyway, so he got her too.
He in Jackson Crawford's translation, I think it was Braggy who Loki called a bench warmer. I loved that insult. Nice way of basically calling him a coward, I think,
Yeah.
is what he was
Yeah.
saying. So when I read this thing about this insult to Gefjon, that handsome boy gave you a necklace. And sometimes Gefjon is one of Freya's names too. So I
Yeah, that's
wondered,
interesting.
like, is she Freya? Are
Yeah,
they
that's a
the
good
same?
question.
But Freya wasn't a Jotun, so that's another one of those places where it's impossible to classify
Well,
them.
Gefjon was a goddess, and she was the fourth goddess. and she was married to a Jotun.
Mhm. Mm.
So she and Ron were both goddesses married to Jotuns. So I don't know.
Hmm.
But that's a similarity. It could have been another boy and another necklace. He doesn't mention four boys, just one.
And he says boy, not dwarf. So, yeah.
So you have mentioned Fulla quite a few times, just in passing, the goddess Fulla.
Hmm. Are you going to tell us about her?
I'll tell you what I know, and you might want to add to it. So she is supposedly the goddess of abundance and service. She's the loyal handmaiden to Frigga, who's the queen of the Aesir. And she's not as well known, but she does hold a special place in Norse mythology due to her unwavering support and care of Frigga.
Hmm.
Now, you told us that she sent Frigga somewhere just a little bit ago.
No, that was
Frigga sent,
Nana. Nana
no,
had
that's
given
right.
the linen robe
Frigg.
to Hermod to give to
And
Ulla to
a
give to,
gold
yeah.
finger ring to give to Fulla.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So for some reason, she was grateful to
Yeah.
Fulla. We don't know why,
That's
though.
really all I know about her. Yeah.
Yeah, not a
But she
lot.
must have been important if she was sending a gold finger ring to her.
Yeah, yeah, very important. Well, then I'll list a few other ones where we only know a little bit about them. There's Sjoffen, who's the inciter of passion, and she's a goddess associated with love. And she is mentioned in the Prose Edda and in three kennings employed in skaldic poetry. And that's
Hmm.
about all we know about her. Lofen, the comforter, is so gentle and so good to invoke that she has permission from the All Father or Frigg to arrange unions between men and women, even if earlier offers have been received and they've set the banns. From her name comes the word lof, meaning permission as well as high praise.
Hmm.
That's interesting. Then we have Var, and she's the goddess of the oaths, and she listens to people's oaths and their private agreements that women and men make to each other. And these contracts are called Varar. She punishes those who break them. And in the poetic Edda poem Thrymsvida, the blessing of Var is invoked by the Jotun Thrymr after his bride, who is actually Loki in disguise, is hallowed with the stolen hammer of Thor, Mjolnir. So he's not invoking Thor or Freya, he's invoking this goddess Var.
Hmm.
So that's one of the few mentions of her, but she must have been important if she was
Hmm.
invoked at weddings.
And oaths too, because oaths were
Mhm.
so important in the
And of
Norse
course, a
culture.
marriage was an oath.
Hmm.
Very interesting. And then there's another goddess named Ver, I think is how you pronounce it. In the Poetic Edda, she's listed as the 10th. And it's said that she's wise and inquiring, so that nothing can be concealed from her. And so it's also said that a saying exists where a woman becomes aware, vor, of something when she finds out about something.
Hmm.
So it's like the revealing of
Hmm.
something. Then there's Snotra, which has it's a very unfortunate name, but it
Yeah.
means wise and courteous. It's said that a wise man or woman can be called Snoter. Okay. So it means a little different. And in Gautrik's saga, she's the mother of Gautrik, son of Gauti. And that's the ancestor of the Geats or the Goths, and a son of Odin as king of Svitjod. So then there's Gna. I don't know how to pronounce that.
I don't either.
It looks like Gna to me. And according to Gylfaginning, she's Frigg's messenger, and she rides a horse named Hofvarpnir,
Mm.
which is a mouthful. And this horse can run across the sea and the sky.
Mm. Cool. I'd love to see him ride across the sky.
Yeah, well, one of my characters names her horse Hofvarpnir.
Oh, nice.
Yes.
You mentioned something with Gefjon about how unmarried women who die went to her.
Hmm.
That had me thinking, perhaps instead of everything being so binary in the Norse world, like these people go to Valhalla and these people go to hell or hell's realm, did they have some kind of a belief that unmarried people went here or women went here, these people went here, these people went here? Like there were goddesses that would and gods that would embrace different different people who died in different ways. I mean,
It's a good question. It kind of seems that way.
it does seem that way.
Mhm.
And that makes so much more sense. Like, why would just an unmarried woman, have to go to hell? Why?
Well, and the thing is, even though hell is described, her hall is described horribly,
Hmm.
hell is not completely a terrible place. In hell, you get what you deserve. And some people live
Oh.
quite comfortably in hell, but others are being, eaten by wolves and in the river of knives and swords and eaten by serpents and ripped by wolves. So, you get what you deserve in
Hmm.
hell. It's not all bad. And it's hell's job to make sure that the people who come to her get what they deserve.
I see. Kind of like, I think it isn't it in the Egyptian mythology where the souls are weighed. When you go to the
Yes.
underworld world, it's weighed like with your crimes and that kind of stuff, and
Mhm.
that depends on what's going to happen to you. But I wonder if that binary is like it comes from Snorri or some of the Christians who are like, you've got heaven and you've got hell.
Right.
There's nothing else, but maybe the actual people in the Norse, the pre-Christian Scandinavians were like, no, unmarried women go here, young boys who have never fought go here, these people go here or whatever. Or
Well, and obviously they're being chosen. So,
yeah, uh-huh.
Freya and Odin choose the people they
Hmm.
want in their armies, and the rest of them go elsewhere.
Yeah. Hmm.
And those maybe are chosen also, and maybe it's for certain attributes. I mean,
Hmm.
because Odin and Freya choose those who die in battle, who
Hmm.
fought bravely and who've proven themselves in battle. That's why they choose people who are killed in battle. But those who die of other things, they die unmarried, they die of sickness, they have different attributes.
Hmm. Or
So,
even the ones who drown, they go to Ron.
right, right,
Well, and part of the reason to choose those warriors in battle is to create that army,
right,
that Einherjar, to help at the end of the world to fight the forces of evil.
right. And all of the dwellers of hell fight against them.
Hmm. The
So she's got her
creepiest
own
thing,
army.
yeah, that's true. And the creepiest thing is the whole with clipping your nails and
Yes. Oh, and the ship,
the ship made out of the nails.
Malfarier. I can't pronounce it right, but yeah, I
It's
know
just gross.
the nails. Yeah, I know. So now you want to tell us about a Jotun woman named Gerd, right?
Yes,
That's
yes.
quite a story.
Yeah. So her story is told in the Poetic Edda in the Skirnismal, which is named after Skirnir, the messenger who goes between the god Frey and Gerd. And the poem starts with Frey sitting on Odin's throne and looking out over all the worlds, which I thought was interesting because I didn't know any other people could just sit on Odin's throne
Well,
and check
Freya
things.
does too. Or no, Frigg does as well.
Oh,
Yes.
yeah. And this actually reminds me, do you remember that scene in The Lord of the Rings when Frodo sits on the seat of
Yes.
seeing and he can see what's happening in Middle Earth? In the movie, the scene is pretty short, but in the books, he can see like what's going on up in the Mirkwood and he can see what's going on in all these different places. And that's kind of what makes him decide he has to break the fellowship and take the ring. But
Right.
it kind of reminds me of that. I'm sure Tolkien
That's where
got
he
that
got it.
idea of
You
sitting
know.
on a throne and seeing all the worlds comes from Odin's throne.
Mhm.
Well, back to Frey. While he was sitting on the throne, he looked over into Jotunheim and he spotted a beautiful woman who was walking in between her house and her father's house. And Frey fell instantly in love with this Jotun woman. He said that her arms shone so bright they reflected in all the air and sea.
Wow.
And That woman means more to me than any woman has ever meant to any young man. He sounds like a love-struck teenager.
Yes, he does.
And then he also admits that the gods and the elves won't agree to the marriage, although I don't understand because he's just now saying that he's seen her. So I don't understand how they even know about it
Well,
yet.
I don't think they do know about it, but I think that it's because she's a Jotun.
Oh,
They're enemies.
but everybody's always
I know, I
intermarrying
know.
anyway.
That's
Or
just a guess.
maybe he's just being a bit of a Romeo, like, oh,
Yeah.
my family will never let me marry her. And this is another mention of elves with the gods to show that they did mingle and they had influence, but we aren't
Yeah.
given anything more than just like, oh, the gods and the elves won't let me marry her. So these little tidbits that make me crazy. I want to know more about them. So love struck Frey gives Skirnir, his messenger, a horse and his own sword, and Skirnir sets off to find this lovely Jotun woman, Gerd. And in the Viking era, it was customary for another man to ask
Yes.
for a woman's hand in marriage on behalf of the would-be groom. It was usually a male relative, usually the father, but I guess in this case, it's the messenger because I guess Frey realizes nobody else is going to agree to it.
Well, Harold Finehair sent his men to
Oh, mm-hmm.
uh, to Gita to ask for her hand, and she's the one who said, "Not he's just a petty king, and I won't marry him until he's king of all of Norway."
Oh,
And
that's interesting. And
yes,
what was the woman in Eve? Olga? Olga the Red, maybe? I think her name was. And after her husband was killed by this one guy, I forget who he was, he sent his men
hmm
to to ask for her hand and she killed them. And I love that story of Olga. Maybe we should talk about Olga. She's
yeah,
she's
maybe
from Kiev, but she was
he
something
was
else.
something else. She really was.
So yeah, sending off somebody, Frey not going himself was very customary. It was the right thing for him to do.
Yep.
And in the prose edda, it says that Frey giving his sword to Skirnir is the reason he doesn't have it when Ragnarok comes. So Frey has to fight with a stag's horn.
hmm
But honestly, I think it's way cooler that he's fighting with a stag's horn than with a sword.
Yeah, very much.
And like a good maiden in myth and fairy tales, Gerd is guarded by fierce dogs.
hmm Like
And
Lagertha,
yes,
a bear and a dog, right?
yeah. And then who was it that was guarded by a dragon that Ragnar had to fight? Didn't he have to fight a dragon too?
Yeah, but anyway, that
Yeah.
was
There's always dogs protecting or somebody protecting the maiden.
Mhm.
Garrett heard Skirnir outside, and so she invited him in for a drink of mead, like a good hostess should. And then she asked if he was one of the Aesir, the Vanir, or an elf. So
Interesting.
there's another indication that maybe the elves, they're either important and they must look similar to the
Mhm.
to the other gods. And he responds that he's none of those. And he informs her that he has 11 golden apples to give her if she will marry Frey.
Oh,
Well, Gerd seems a little put out by this offer. And she vows that she will never marry Frey. And now Skirnir has a counter offer. He offers her Odin's ring Draupnir, which is a good offer because Draupnir will produce eight more gold rings every
ninth night.
ninth night.
That's
Yeah.
compound interest, It must
I
be the
know,
beginning
right?
of compound interest.
What happens with all that gold? I don't know. But she refuses, saying her father's house has no lack of gold. So by this time, Skirner's getting a little irritated and he resorts to threats and he threatens to cut off her head. But that doesn't even phase her because she's a Jotun. After all, when we learned about Scothy last episode, we learned that they are not shrinking violets. And she tells him she's just not going to suffer his threats. But then things get ugly. Skirner threatens to cut off her father's head. to beat her with a club until he tames her. And then he tears into a torrent of curses of awful things that will happen to her if she continues to refuse Frey's proposal of marriage. Unendurable pain. She'll weep and never be happy. Monsters and trolls will maul and abuse her. She'll have a three-headed giant as a husband.
Jeez.
She'll rot with illness. She'll have to drink goat's urine. I mean, it's just, and all the gods will hate her. And he just goes on, and like it's pretty brutal. And then after this, he curses her to never know a man's love and to never have a husband. And for good measure, he adds the curses of sexual shame, madness, and unbearable suffering. But if she'll just agree to marry Frey, he'll take it all back. She does. She relents, Scared relents, and she tells Skirnir to inform Frey that she'll meet him in a grove after 9 nights, a grove that they both know. And poor angsty Frey complains that he can't possibly wait that long. And that's basically where the poem ends. And then Gerd is also listed among the goddesses who were at a feast held in Asgard for a man named Aegir, who was strong in magic. And there were 12 gods and 9 goddesses at this feast, and she was one of them.
So she must have married Frey.
She must have married Frey. And then, yeah, and then there's that bit about Ragnarok where he didn't have his sword. Unless, yeah.
Well, that doesn't mean they got married, though. It just
right.
That Skirnir never gave it back. Maybe he lost it. We don't know
Skirnir, he doesn't seem like a great guy. And then finally, we have Modguder, and I don't know if she's Jotun. I assume she is because
I thought she was Jotun. I found that in some of my research, but
okay,
she's a maiden anyway.
Yeah, she's a maiden. You know, the Norse aren't quite as obsessed with maidens as like the Greeks were, at least in their mythology. Not that I've noticed.
Well, and also I just recently read something that talked about, that it wasn't really shield maiden, it was shield woman, but it alluded to an unmarried woman. So it didn't mean girl necessarily, it just meant a woman who was not married, and it didn't have the same connotations of purity. It just means she wasn't married.
She just wasn't married. Yeah.
Could have been any age. So anyway, I diverse, but that's what maiden means.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like when women get married in this culture, you have a maid of honor or a maiden of honor. It's just, it's either your married friend or your unmarried friend.
Right. Correct.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily mean virgin either.
Right. So Modguder she guards the bridge that traverses the river Gjöll, which means noisy, that crosses into the land of the dead. And we mentioned Hermod, the messenger, trying to find Balder. And when he comes to Modguder, she asks him his name, which always happens in mythology stories. You have to tell them their name. And she says that the bridge echoed more under him, this one person, than it had with the whole previous party who had passed through, which was Balder's party.
Ah.
And she says that Hermod isn't the right color to be dead. So that makes me think that maybe the dead were light on their feet, and that's why his step echoed more than theirs. He was heavier and he wasn't the right color.
Well, and then from other myths that the dead people were either black or dark blue. And of course, Hel herself is half black. That's right. And that's what led me to believe she was half corpse.
Don't they call it like corpse blue or something like that color? And then Modguder, she asks why Hermod is on this road to hell, and he says he's searching for Balder, and she tells him where to find him. Yeah. And I love,
Modguder features in one of my books where Osa has to go to hell.
Yes, she features in one of my books too. Hilda has to go to hell. And the bridge that goes across the river is like solid gold, and it's
got a roof of gold.
And it's held by like a fine thread of gold. It's like no bigger than a spider's web or something like that.
And there's a battle going on in this bridge. It's a covered bridge, and there's a battle going on.
Oh, I didn't know that.
At least one in it's mentioned in several different places. The place I
Oh,
found it
cool.
talking about a battle, and also that the river Gyo is filled with knives and swords.
Ooh,
And that's what's making the din.
okay.
Yes. Lots of interesting details.
Vikings are just, they're not.
They're very gory.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So that is the last of the goddesses and the Jotun that we've come up with,
Mhm.
which was quite a lot when I was making a list and I was thinking, holy smokes,
I
that's a
know.
lot.
And there's still a few that I couldn't find anything on, but
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
um, you
Yeah, there's
know,
just random mentions like somebody's name here and there, but we don't know who they are. There's gods like that too, that they're
mhm,
just briefly mentioned and like, who's this
mhm.
person? I mean, I have to admit, when we first decided to do this podcast about Norse goddesses, I didn't even think we were going to have enough for one episode, let alone two.
I
I was like, okay, there's a lot on Freya, and we didn't even touch on some of the stories that Freya is in. I mean,
Right.
honestly, we could probably have a whole episode just on her. Um, yeah, okay, we've got a little about Frigg and a few of them, but yeah, but holy smokes, we have enough for two.
Yeah.
I think it just goes to show how much you can find when you dig deeply
Yep.
enough and when
Yep.
you like to do the research, when one thing leads you to something else and to something
hmm
else. Yeah.
hmm And some of it's very hard to find because you can search on a name like Thrud. It was perfect example of that. I looked on search, did a lot of internet searching. I went to the sources, and still I didn't find that story that we've talked about the troll being turned to stone.
Right.
And I knew that story. I just never related that to her.
Right. And same when I saw you listed her and I just didn't even make that connection between her and that story. So,
Yeah,
yeah, even when we know the stories, I mean, there's so much information that we have to take in all at once. Like stuff falls out,
exactly.
you have to remind yourself of,
That's for sure.
yeah.
And what's terrible is when you remember something and you can't find the source.
Sometimes I go to Wikipedia just because they'll have
Yeah,
those at the
we have the
bottom where it
references at the
has where
bottom.
like
Yeah.
oh it's in the poetic edda of this story and then I go and I
Yep.
grab my that is helpful. Wikipedia and I've even some of the kids who come to homework help at the library where I work. It's just like, well, you can start there and it can lead you to some other places.
Yes.
All right, so what do we have for next month?
Women's work, is that what we're going to do next
I
month?
think so.
Yay. And women had specific tasks that were only done by women. And they were weaving and spinning and brewing. Was generally a woman's terrain, although there is mention of men brewing as well, but it's definitely a woman's art. Healing, which we had already had a whole segment on healers and midwives. And we'll dig up some other things, but some of the tapestries, especially the Osberg tapestries, are so interesting and they tell us so much about
Mhm.
the Viking era.
That sounds great.
Yeah,
Right. All right. I guess we have exhausted the world of the Norse goddesses.
yes, we have.
All right. We'll see you next time.
Okay, take care.
Bye. Thanks for listening. You can find Johanna at johannawittenberg.com, where you'll find a free short story, a prequel to her Norse Queen series. And you can find me, KS, at ksbarton.com, where you can also find a free short story from me, a prequel to my Norse family series. See you next time.